3 weeks after 47 seconds of video footage changed his life forever, James Richardson stood before a crowd of 12,000 people in Manchester's largest convention centre. The former Queen's Guard, who had never spoken to an audience larger than his military unit, was now addressing a gathering of workers' rights advocates from across Europe, his words being simultaneously translated into 8 languages and broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world. The transformation had been extraordinary to witness. The shy young man from Yorkshire, who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of standing silently at attention, had discovered a voice that resonated with people who had spent their lives being voiceless. His first tentative interview had led to speaking engagements, which had led to advocacy work, which had culminated in his emergence as one of the most recognizable faces in the global movement for workplace dignity and social justice. But the real transformation had occurred at Buckingham Palace itself, where the viral video had triggered the most comprehensive review of employment practices in the institution's modern history. The global outcry following James's suspension had made it impossible for palace administrators to continue with business as usual. Within days of the video's release, they found themselves facing questions from Parliament, pressure from human rights organizations, and scrutiny from media outlets that had never before shown interest in the working conditions of royal household staff. The investigation that followed had uncovered a culture of inequality and mistreatment that extended far beyond Lord Pemberton's individual cruelty. For decades, palace employees had endured a rigid hierarchy that treated working-class staff as invisible servants whose personal dignity was less important than maintaining aristocratic comfort. The video had exposed this system to a global audience that was no longer willing to accept such treatment as simply the way things were done. Maria Santos had become the unexpected symbol of quiet dignity in the face of systemic injustice. Her transformation from invisible kitchen worker to internationally recognized advocate had been even more dramatic than James's evolution. The woman who had once been afraid to make eye contact with senior staff members was now consulting with labor rights organizations and serving as an advisor to the palace's new employee welfare committee. The changes at the palace had been swift and substantial. A new code of conduct had been implemented that explicitly protected staff members from harassment and abuse, regardless of the status of the person engaging in such behavior. An independent ombudsman had been appointed to investigate complaints and ensure that employees could report problems without fear of retaliation. Most significantly, the palace had publicly acknowledged that its previous employment practices had been inadequate and had committed to becoming a model workplace that reflected modern British values. Lord Pemberton's fate had been sealed by the viral video. The footage of his treatment of Maria had cost him his position on several prestigious boards and had led to his resignation from multiple charitable organizations. The nobleman, who had spent his life believing that his title protected him from consequences, had learned that viral videos were more powerful than inherited privilege. His public apology, delivered under obvious duress, had been widely regarded as too little, too late. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The hashtag #PalaceGuardCourage had evolved into a movement that encouraged people to document and share instances of workplace mistreatment. Workers around the world were using James's example as inspiration to stand up for themselves and their colleagues, and employers were discovering that viral videos could destroy reputations overnight. Corporate training programs were being redesigned to emphasize respectful treatment of all employees, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Human resources departments were implementing new policies to protect workers from harassment and abuse. The business world was slowly recognizing that the digital age had fundamentally changed the calculus of power, making it much more dangerous to mistreat people who might be recording everything on their phones. The legal ramifications had been equally significant. Employment lawyers reported a surge in workplace harassment cases as victims found courage to speak out after seeing James defend Maria. Several high-profile executives had been forced to resign after videos of their inappropriate behavior went viral, creating a new climate of accountability that many had thought was impossible to achieve. Sophie Chun, the teenage tourist whose decision to record and share the video had started everything, had become a symbol of citizen journalism's power to create social change. Her story had inspired young people around the world to use their phones as tools for documenting injustice and holding powerful people accountable. She had received journalism scholarships from several universities and had been invited to speak at conferences about media literacy and digital activism. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the change in public consciousness about the nature of courage and moral responsibility. James's simple decision to defend a colleague during her lunch break had demonstrated that ordinary people possess the power to challenge systems of inequality and create meaningful change. His actions had shown that individual moral courage could still matter in an age dominated by large institutions and complex bureaucracies. The story had also highlighted the democratizing power of social media technology. For centuries, incidents like Lord Pemberton's treatment of Maria would have remained private matters, witnessed only by those who were too powerless to do anything about them. The presence of smartphones and social media platforms had fundamentally altered the balance of power, making it possible for anyone to document injustice and share it with a global audience. Educational institutions had begun incorporating the incident into curricula about ethics, leadership, and social responsibility. Business schools were using the video as a case study in crisis management and reputation protection. Psychology professors were analyzing the footage to understand the dynamics of bystander intervention and moral courage. The 47 seconds of video had become a rich source of material for understanding human behavior under pressure. The personal cost of James's decision had been substantial, but had ultimately led to opportunities he could never have imagined while standing guard at Buckingham Palace. His military career was over, but he had found a new calling as an advocate for workplace dignity and social justice. The speaking fees from his appearances provided financial security that exceeded his previous salary, and the knowledge that his actions had inspired positive change gave his life a sense of purpose that his guard duty had never provided. Maria Santos had used her newfound platform to advocate for the rights of immigrant workers who often faced similar treatment to what she had experienced. Her story had resonated particularly strongly with women who worked in service industries and who had endured years of disrespectful treatment from customers and supervisors. She had become living proof that dignity was not something that could be taken away by those who held power over others. The relationship between James and Maria had evolved into a deep friendship based on their shared experience of that transformative Tuesday morning. They appeared together at conferences and speaking engagements, representing the power of solidarity between people who chose to stand up for what was right rather than what was convenient. Their partnership had become a symbol of how moral courage could create bonds that transcended differences in background, culture, and experience. Colonel Harrison, who had initially suspended James for his breach of protocol, had eventually become one of his strongest supporters within the military establishment. The colonel's own investigation of the incident had led him to conclude that James's actions represented the highest ideals of military service, protecting those who could not protect themselves and standing up for justice even at personal cost. His recommendation had helped James receive an honorable discharge rather than facing court-martial proceedings. The palace's new employment policies had been developed in consultation with labor rights organizations and had become a model for other large institutions seeking to modernize their workplace cultures. The changes had included not only protection from harassment, but also improved wages, better working conditions, and genuine opportunities for career advancement regardless of background or social class. 6 months after the viral video, James received a letter that brought his transformation full circle. It was from a young girl in Scotland who had seen him speak about courage and moral responsibility at a school assembly. She wrote that his example had given her the strength to report a teacher who had been bullying students from immigrant families. The teacher had been removed from the classroom, and several other students had found the courage to speak up about their own experiences. The letter reminded James that his decision to defend Maria had created ripple effects that extended far beyond anything he could track or measure. Somewhere around the world, people were finding courage to stand up for themselves and others because they had seen a palace guard choose human dignity over career security. The knowledge that his actions continued to inspire others gave James a sense of fulfillment that no uniform or paycheck had ever provided. As James read the young girl's letter in his London flat, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that Tuesday morning when he had made the split-second decision to abandon his post. The man who had once measured success by his ability to remain motionless for hours at a time now measured it by his ability to move others toward justice and compassion. The viral video that had initially seemed like a career-ending disaster had actually been the beginning of James's true calling. His example had proven that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power to create change when they chose courage over comfort and moral clarity over personal advancement. The 47 seconds of footage that Sophie Chun had captured would continue to inspire people long after the initial media frenzy had faded. The story of James Richardson, Maria Santos, and Lord Pemberton had become more than just a viral video about workplace harassment. It had become a testament to the enduring power of individual moral courage in an age of institutional indifference. It had shown that sometimes the most important stand a person can take is simply refusing to be a bystander when witnessing injustice. In boardrooms and break rooms, in palaces and ordinary workplaces around the world, people continued to share the story of a palace guard who remembered that being human was more important than following orders. The video would eventually be viewed by over 200 million people, but its true impact could not be measured in clicks or shares. It could only be measured in the moments of courage it inspired, the voices it helped people find, and the dignity it helped restore to those who had been forgotten by systems designed to keep them invisible. James Richardson had walked away from his post for 47 seconds. In return, he had given the world a reminder that some things matter more than career security, institutional loyalty, or personal comfort. He had shown that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right regardless of the consequences. The palace guard had become a global symbol of resistance to indifference, and the world had become a slightly more just place because one person had decided that human dignity was worth defending, even when no one was watching. Except, as it turned out, everyone was watching, and they would remember what they saw for a very long time. The numbers were staggering. By noon on Wednesday, Sophie Chin's video had been viewed 43 million times across all platforms. The hashtag #PalaceGuardCourage was trending in 16 countries, and news organizations from Tokyo to Sao Paulo were running segments about the confrontation that had occurred in a London courtyard less than 24 hours earlier. James Richardson stared at his television screen in complete disbelief as CNN's international correspondent discussed his actions with a panel of experts in human rights, military protocol, and British constitutional law. The young man who had grown up in anonymity in a Yorkshire mining town was now being analyzed and debated by people who had never heard his name before Tuesday morning but were suddenly experts on his character and motivations. The media coverage was unlike anything James could have imagined. The story had transcended the usual categories of news reporting and had become something that touched on fundamental questions about justice, courage, and the relationship between institutions and individuals. Editorial writers in major newspapers were using James's actions as a starting point for broader discussions about class, privilege, and moral responsibility in modern society. But it wasn't just professional journalists who were responding to the video. Social media platforms were flooded with personal stories from people who had experienced similar situations in their own lives. Workers from around the world were sharing accounts of being mistreated by employers, customers, or authority figures, and many were crediting James's example with giving them courage to speak out about their own experiences. The response from the British public was particularly intense. James's working-class background had resonated deeply with millions of people who saw their own struggles reflected in his story. The video had crystallized feelings about inequality and social justice that had been building for years, and James had become an unwitting symbol of resistance against a system that many felt had forgotten about ordinary working people. At Buckingham Palace, the morning had begun with an emergency meeting of senior administrators who were struggling to comprehend how their careful damage control strategy had been completely overwhelmed by the viral spread of footage they thought had been eliminated. Deputy Administrator Phillips looked haggard as he reported that every major news organization in the world was requesting interviews, statements, or comments about the incident. Colonel Harrison found himself in the unprecedented position of having to explain military discipline to a global audience that seemed more interested in celebrating the breakdown of that discipline than in understanding its importance. The traditional tools of institutional management, controlled messaging, reliable media contacts, and gradual news cycles had been rendered obsolete by the speed and scope of social media distribution. The palace's initial response had been crafted for a different era of media coverage. Their prepared statement emphasized the importance of maintaining proper protocols and suggested that James's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, represented a concerning breach of professional conduct that could not be tolerated in an institution that depended on order and tradition for its effectiveness. The statement was released at 10:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning and was immediately overwhelmed by a tsunami of public criticism unlike anything the palace had experienced in decades. Within hours, the statement had been dissected, criticized, and ridiculed by millions of people who saw it as a tone-deaf attempt to defend the indefensible. The phrase, well-intentioned breach of conduct, became a viral meme representing institutional callousness toward human decency. Lord Pemberton, meanwhile, had retreated to his country estate where he was discovering that inherited privilege provided little protection against the democratizing force of viral video. His personal assistant reported that the estate's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls from journalists, and protesters had begun gathering at the main gate. The nobleman who had enjoyed decades of unchallenged authority was experiencing public scrutiny for the first time in his life. The footage of Lord Pemberton's treatment of Maria Santos had exposed a side of British aristocracy that most people had only suspected existed. His cruel words and imperious demeanor confirmed every negative stereotype about inherited privilege and entitlement. The contrast between his behavior and James's courage had created a narrative that was both simple enough for viral consumption and complex enough to sustain serious analysis. Maria Santos had become an unwitting figure in the global conversation as well. The dignity with which she had eventually confronted Lord Pemberton had inspired millions of viewers, and her story had become emblematic of the quiet courage shown by working people around the world who face similar treatment, but rarely have their struggles recorded and shared. The palace kitchen where Maria worked had been transformed overnight into something resembling a media circus. Journalists were attempting to interview her colleagues, photographers were trying to capture images of her workplace, and security personnel were struggling to maintain normal operations while dealing with unprecedented public attention. Maria herself had been given the day off while palace administrators tried to determine how to handle her newfound fame. The woman who had spent 15 years being invisible in the palace hierarchy was now being discussed on international news programs and held up as an example of grace under pressure. The irony was not lost on her that she had become visible to the world only after being treated worse than she had ever been treated before. The response from other palace staff members was complex and revealing. Many expressed pride in James's actions and admiration for Maria's dignity, but others worried about what the incident meant for their own job security. The palace was known for preferring employees who maintained discretion and avoided drawing attention to themselves, and the viral video had brought exactly the kind of scrutiny that the institution typically sought to avoid. Some staff members reported feeling more empowered to speak up about their own experiences with disrespectful treatment, while others became more cautious about their behavior, fearing that any interaction might be recorded and shared with the world. The video had created an atmosphere where everyone understood that privacy and anonymity could no longer be guaranteed, even within the supposedly secure confines of the royal residence. The international response to the video was particularly striking. In countries with their own histories of rigid class systems and authoritarian institutions, James's actions were being interpreted as a universal statement about human dignity transcending social hierarchies. The story was being translated into dozens of languages and shared across cultural boundaries that normally limited the spread of British news stories. In France, newspapers were drawing parallels between James's courage and the spirit of resistance that had defined important moments in French history. In India, commentators were using the incident to discuss the lingering effects of colonial attitudes and the importance of standing up to inherited privilege. In South Africa, the story was being connected to ongoing struggles for economic equality and social justice. American media coverage was particularly extensive, with cable news networks running lengthy segments analyzing the incident through the lens of American debates about class, privilege, and individual courage. The story seemed to resonate particularly strongly with American audiences who had their own complex relationship with inherited wealth and institutional authority. By Wednesday afternoon, James had received calls from literary agents, television producers, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell his story. Publishers were interested in book deals, speakers' bureaus were offering lucrative contracts, and advocacy organizations were inviting him to become a spokesperson for various causes related to workers' rights and social justice. The flood of opportunities was overwhelming for someone who had never sought public attention and had made his moral stand without any thought of personal benefit. James found himself in the surreal position of being offered financial rewards for actions that had cost him his career and had been motivated purely by conscience rather than calculation. The offers also presented him with ethical dilemmas that he had never expected to face. Should he profit from a video that had also brought unwanted attention to Maria Santos? Would accepting money for his story somehow diminish the moral purity of his original actions? How could he ensure that any benefits he received would also help the woman he had defended? The questions became more complex as James learned about the broader impact of the video. Workers' rights organizations were using his story to advocate for stronger protections against workplace harassment. Political activists were pointing to the incident as evidence of the need for greater social and economic equality. Even academic researchers were beginning to study the video as an example of how social media could amplify moral courage and create momentum for social change. James realized that his simple desire to defend Maria during her lunch break had accidentally become part of much larger conversations about power, justice, and human dignity. The personal had become political in ways that he had never intended or anticipated. The palace administration was struggling with similar questions about the broader implications of the incident. The video had raised fundamental questions about the institution's values and its treatment of employees that couldn't be answered with traditional public relations strategies. The global response suggested that millions of people saw the palace's initial handling of the incident as representative of broader problems with elite institutions and their relationship with ordinary people. Wednesday evening brought news that would further complicate an already complex situation. Sophie Chun, the young woman who had recorded and shared the original video, had decided to reveal her role in the story. In a carefully crafted social media post, she explained her decision to share the footage and her belief that some stories were too important to be suppressed by institutional damage control. Sophie's revelation added another layer to the narrative and raised new questions about the role of citizen journalism in holding powerful people accountable. Her decision to preserve and share the video despite official requests to delete it was being hailed by some as an act of civic courage and criticized by others as a violation of privacy and security protocols. The young woman's explanation of her motivations provided insight into how a new generation approached questions of authority, transparency, and moral responsibility. Sophie had grown up in a world where information wanted to be free and where ordinary people possessed unprecedented power to document and share important events. Her actions represented a generational shift in the relationship between institutions and individuals that the palace was still struggling to understand. As Wednesday night fell over London, James Richardson sat in his small flat surrounded by newspapers, magazines, and printouts of social media posts that discussed his actions from every conceivable angle. The man who had simply wanted to defend a colleague from cruel treatment had become the center of a global conversation about courage, dignity, and the price of doing what's right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new questions about what happens when an ordinary person becomes an accidental symbol of resistance against systems that have remained unchanged for centuries. The viral video had set in motion forces that none of the participants could control, and the consequences would ripple outward in ways that would surprise everyone involved. The world was watching to see what would happen next in a story that had begun with 47 seconds of footage but had already changed the lives of everyone it touched. The palace officials arrived like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. James could see Colonel Harrison approaching with the quick, purposeful stride that every soldier recognized as the prelude to serious consequences. Behind him walked Deputy Administrator Phillips, whose nervous expression suggested that this incident had already reached levels of the hierarchy that preferred to remain invisible to the public. James returned to attention as Colonel Harrison approached, but the damage was already done. Every witness to the confrontation understood that the unwritten rules of palace life had been shattered beyond repair. The colonel's weathered face revealed nothing as he surveyed the scene, but James could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. This wasn't just about military discipline anymore. It was about public relations, international reputation, and the increasingly fragile relationship between Britain's ancient institutions and its modern citizens. Lord Pemberton had regained some of his composure by the time the officials arrived, but his earlier display of cruelty had been too public and too well documented to simply disappear. The nobleman attempted to control the narrative by immediately lodging complaints about James's conduct, but his words rang hollow after what everyone had witnessed. The young tourist with her phone had been joined by others, creating a small crowd of people who had recorded at least portions of the encounter. Colonel Harrison's first priority was damage control. He ordered the immediate dispersal of the gathered crowd and instructed the tourists to delete any footage they might have captured. The request was polite but firm, backed by the subtle authority that came with decades of military service. Most of the tourists complied, or at least appeared to comply, but James noticed that several people discreetly pocketed their phones before the colonel could inspect them. The young girl who had recorded the entire confrontation was among those who seemed to comply with the colonel's request. She nodded respectfully and appeared to delete the video from her phone while the official watched. What Colonel Harrison didn't see was the slight smile that crossed her face as she performed the deletion. Like millions of her generation, she understood that digital content could exist in multiple places simultaneously, and that hitting delete in front of an authority figure didn't necessarily mean destroying everything. Maria Santos had returned to her bench, but her posture remained different from before the confrontation. The transformation that James had witnessed couldn't be undone simply because officials had arrived to restore order. She sat straighter, looked people in the eye, and no longer seemed to shrink into invisibility when authority figures appeared. The change was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had known her before that morning. James was escorted away from the scene for what Colonel Harrison termed immediate debriefing, but which everyone understood to be the beginning of disciplinary proceedings. As they walked across the courtyard, James caught sight of Maria watching him go. She nodded slightly in his direction, a gesture of gratitude that made everything he was about to face seem worthwhile. The debriefing room was a sterile space deep within the palace administrative wing, far from the public areas where tourists gathered to glimpse royal life. James had been in similar rooms before for routine matters, but never under circumstances like these. Colonel Harrison sat across from him at a plain wooden table, while Deputy Administrator Phillips took notes on everything that was said. The questions began immediately. Colonel Harrison wanted to understand exactly what had motivated James to abandon his post, whether he had received any outside encouragement to intervene, and what he expected the consequences of his actions to be. The colonel's tone was professional but cold, suggesting that James's military career was hanging by a thread that was growing thinner with each answer. James responded to each question with complete honesty. He explained that he had witnessed what he considered to be unacceptable treatment of a fellow human being and had felt compelled to intervene. He acknowledged that his actions violated protocol, but maintained that some situations transcended normal operating procedures. When asked if he regretted his decision, James looked Colonel Harrison directly in the eye and said that his only regret was that it had taken him so long to act. The response seemed to catch both officials off guard. They had clearly expected either defiance or remorse, but James's calm acceptance of responsibility while maintaining the moral correctness of his position left them uncertain how to proceed. Deputy Administrator Phillips scribbled frantically in his notebook, while Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying James with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Meanwhile, 8 miles away in a small flat in East London, 16-year-old Sophie Chun was about to change the course of the entire story. Sophie had been visiting London with her school group when she stumbled upon the confrontation at Buckingham Palace. Her decision to record the incident had been instinctive, driven by the same social media reflexes that governed much of her generation's interaction with the world around them. Sophie's understanding of digital privacy was sophisticated in ways that Colonel Harrison couldn't have imagined. Before she had even left the palace grounds, she had uploaded the video to 3 different cloud storage services and shared it with her 2 closest friends. When the colonel had asked her to delete the footage, she had complied with the letter of his request while completely ignoring its spirit. Back in her flat, Sophie watched the video again on her laptop. The 47 seconds of footage captured everything: Lord Pemberton's cruelty, Maria's dignity in the face of humiliation, James's courage in abandoning his post, and the transformation of both the guard and the kitchen worker during their confrontation with privilege and power. Sophie had grown up in a world where viral videos could topple governments and change social movements, and she recognized immediately that she possessed something significant. The decision of whether to share the video publicly wasn't easy for Sophie. She understood that posting it could have serious consequences for the people involved, particularly for James, whose career would certainly be destroyed if the footage became public. But she also understood that some stories were too important to be buried by institutional damage control. Sophie spent 2 hours researching the people involved in the confrontation. She discovered Lord Pemberton's history of controversial statements and his family's legacy of inherited privilege. She found articles about palace employment practices and the way working-class staff members were expected to accept mistreatment as part of their jobs. Most importantly, she found other stories of people who had been silenced when they tried to speak out against powerful figures. The more Sophie learned, the more convinced she became that the video needed to be seen. She crafted a careful caption that provided context without revealing personal information about James or Maria. She explained that the footage showed a palace guard defending a kitchen worker from what appeared to be verbal abuse by a nobleman, and she let viewers draw their own conclusions about what they were witnessing. At 7:43 p.m. on Tuesday evening, Sophie Chin posted the video to her social media accounts with the caption, "Sometimes courage looks like a palace guard who remembers he's human first." She tagged it with hashtags related to social justice, workers' rights, and British politics, then went to make dinner with her family. By the time Sophie finished eating, the video had been shared 200 times. By the time she went to bed, it had reached 10,000 shares. By morning, it would be viewed by millions of people around the world, but Sophie was already asleep, unaware that she had just lit a fuse that would explode across every major news network on the planet. Back at Buckingham Palace, James's debriefing had concluded with Colonel Harrison's announcement that he would be suspended pending a full investigation. The colonel explained that James's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, had violated fundamental protocols and created a public relations crisis that would require careful management. James would be required to remain available for further questioning and would be prohibited from speaking to the press about the incident. James accepted the suspension without argument. He had known that his career would be forfeit the moment he took his first step away from his post, and he felt strangely at peace with that reality. 8 years of military service had given him valuable skills and experiences, but it had also taught him that some things mattered more than career advancement or institutional loyalty. As James cleaned out his locker that evening, he reflected on the events of the day with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had no idea that his actions had already been recorded and would soon be seen around the world. In his mind, the confrontation with Lord Pemberton had been a private moment of moral clarity that had cost him his job, but preserved his integrity. The palace administration worked through the night to develop a response strategy for what they expected would be minor media interest in the incident. Deputy Administrator Phillips had contacted several reliable journalists who could be trusted to present the story from the institution's perspective, emphasizing the importance of protocol and discipline in maintaining royal dignity. The plan was to frame James's actions as a well-meaning but misguided breach of professional conduct that had been appropriately addressed through internal disciplinary procedures. What the palace officials didn't know was that their carefully planned narrative would be completely overwhelmed by a video that was already spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. By dawn, millions of people would have watched James Richardson defend Maria Santos with a courage that transcended uniforms, protocols, and centuries of established hierarchy. The story they thought they could control was about to become much larger than any of them had imagined. The 47 seconds of footage that Sophie Chun had captured would soon force one of the world's oldest institutions to confront questions about power, privilege, and human dignity that they had spent generations avoiding. James woke up on Wednesday morning to 17 missed calls on his phone and a text message from his sister telling him to turn on the news immediately. He reached for his television remote with a growing sense of dread, having no idea that he was about to see himself transformed from a suspended palace guard into an international symbol of moral courage. The video was everywhere. Every major news network was running the story. Every social media platform was buzzing with commentary. And every newspaper was scrambling to provide context for footage that seemed to capture something essential about the struggle between those who have power and those who suffer under it. James Richardson had wanted to defend one woman's dignity during her lunch break. Instead, he had started a global conversation about respect, courage, and the price of standing up for what's right. The young man who had walked away from his post 24 hours earlier was about to discover that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is the first step toward finding everything you never knew you needed. The world had seen the video. Now they were waiting to see what would happen next. The sound of James's boots on the cobblestones seemed unnaturally loud as he approached the scene that would soon dominate headlines across the globe. Each step carried him further from the safety of protocol and closer to a confrontation that would test everything he believed about courage, duty, and human dignity. Lord Pemberton had his back to James as he continued his verbal assault on Maria Santos. His voice had taken on the tone of someone who enjoyed wielding power over others, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum humiliation. Maria sat frozen on the bench, her dark eyes wide with shock and pain. She clutched her uniform apron with trembling fingers, as if holding onto the last shred of her dignity. The words that James heard as he drew closer would stay with him for the rest of his life. Lord Pemberton was not simply criticizing Maria's work or expressing dissatisfaction with some service. He was attacking her very humanity, using language that belonged in the darkest chapters of history rather than in the courtyard of a modern palace. His assistant stood nearby, checking his phone with practiced indifference, while the third man observed the scene with the detached interest of someone watching entertainment. James was close enough now to see the tears streaming down Maria's cheeks. She had worked at the palace for 15 years, arriving before sunrise and staying long after sunset to ensure that every meal was perfect. She had served kings and queens, prime ministers and presidents, always with grace and professionalism. Yet here she sat, being reduced to nothing more than a target for one man's cruelty. The other staff members who had been enjoying their break had scattered like leaves in a strong wind. James didn't blame them for their retreat. They all had families to feed and bills to pay. Standing up to someone like Lord Pemberton was a luxury that few working people could afford. The palace hierarchy was as rigid as the ancient stones of its foundation, and everyone knew their place within it. Everyone except James Richardson, who was about to throw that hierarchy into chaos. As he took his final steps toward the group, James caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A young tourist, probably no more than 16 years old, had her phone out and was recording the entire incident. The girl looked uncertain, as if she understood that she was witnessing something significant but wasn't sure what to do about it. Her finger hovered over her phone screen, and James realized that this moment was already being preserved for posterity. The weight of that realization should have stopped him in his tracks. Every action he was about to take would be documented and shared. There would be no way to quietly handle the situation or minimize the damage to his career. Yet somehow, the presence of that camera gave him strength rather than fear. If this moment was going to be recorded, then at least the world would see what Lord Pemberton was really like behind the polished facade of aristocratic respectability. Lord Pemberton's tirade reached a crescendo just as James arrived within earshot. The nobleman was now pointing an accusing finger at Maria, while his voice dripped with contempt and hatred. He was calling her names that had no place in civilized society, questioning her right to work at the palace, and suggesting that people like her should know their place and stay in it. James cleared his throat. The sound cut through Lord Pemberton's rant like a sword through silk. The nobleman turned around, his face still flushed with artificial rage, expecting to see another staff member who would quickly retreat from his presence. Instead, he found himself face to face with a Queen's Guard whose steel-gray eyes held no trace of submission or fear. For a moment, the courtyard fell completely silent. Even the distant sounds of London traffic seemed to fade away as two men from very different worlds stared at each other across a divide that represented centuries of British class structure. Lord Pemberton's expensive suit and manicured appearance stood in sharp contrast to James's military precision and working-class dignity. Lord Pemberton was the first to speak, his voice carrying the imperious tone of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. He demanded to know why James had abandoned his post, and suggested that such behavior was exactly what one could expect from people of his background. The nobleman's words revealed more about his character than he probably intended, exposing prejudices that ran far deeper than his treatment of Maria. James listened to the verbal assault without flinching. He had heard similar words before, whispered in the halls of privilege whenever someone like him dared to rise above his expected station. The difference was that now those words were being spoken in front of witnesses, recorded by a camera that would soon share them with the world. When Lord Pemberton finished his opening salvo, James responded with a calm dignity that seemed to catch the nobleman off guard. He explained that he had witnessed the treatment of Mrs. Santos and felt compelled to intervene. His voice was steady and professional, but there was an underlying steel that made it clear he would not be easily dismissed. The young tourist with the phone had moved closer, her device capturing every word and gesture. James was aware of her presence, but chose not to acknowledge it directly. He understood that this confrontation would soon extend far beyond the palace walls, but he had passed the point where consequences could deter him from doing what he believed was right. Lord Pemberton seemed genuinely shocked that a mere guard would dare to challenge his authority. He began to lecture James about knowing his place and respecting his betters, using language that revealed a worldview stuck somewhere in the 19th century. The nobleman's sense of entitlement was so complete that he appeared incapable of recognizing the humanity of those he considered beneath him. It was then that James made the statement that would soon echo around the world. Looking Lord Pemberton directly in the eye, he said that no human being deserved to be treated with such cruelty, regardless of their position in society. He pointed out that Mrs. Santos had done nothing wrong except try to eat her lunch in peace, and that Lord Pemberton's behavior was unworthy of any civilized person, let alone someone who claimed to represent British values. The words hit Lord Pemberton like physical blows. His face turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized that a working-class soldier was lecturing him about proper behavior. The nobleman's assistant finally looked up from his phone, sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond normal parameters. The third man took a step backward, suddenly, less eager to be associated with whatever was unfolding. Maria Santos remained on the bench, her tears still flowing. But now there was something different in her expression. The despair was being replaced by something that looked like hope. For 15 years, she had endured condescending remarks and dismissive treatment from people who considered themselves her superiors. Now, for the first time, someone was standing up for her publicly and without reservation. Lord Pemberton attempted to regain control of the situation by threatening James's career. He claimed to have connections throughout the military hierarchy and promised that James would face severe consequences for his insubordination. The nobleman seemed to believe that fear of professional retaliation would force James to retreat and apologize. Instead, James took another step forward. The movement was small but significant. It demonstrated that he was not intimidated by Lord Pemberton's threats and was prepared to continue defending Maria regardless of the personal cost. The gesture was captured perfectly by the young tourist's camera, creating an image that would soon symbolize resistance to privilege and power. James then did something that no one expected. He removed his bearskin hat and placed it on the ground beside Maria's bench. The action violated every protocol of his position, but it served a deeper purpose. By literally setting aside the symbol of his official duty, James was making it clear that he was no longer speaking as a Queen's Guard but as a human being defending another human being. The removal of his hat created a ripple effect throughout the small crowd that had begun to gather. Palace staff who had retreated earlier began to edge closer, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a guard abandoning his formal bearing to make a moral stand. Tourists who had noticed the commotion were now openly filming the encounter, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Lord Pemberton's response to James's gesture revealed the true depth of his character. Instead of showing any recognition that his behavior might have been inappropriate, he doubled down on his attacks. He began to insult not only James but his family background, his education, and his right to wear the uniform of the Queen's Guard. The nobleman's words became increasingly vicious as he realized that his usual methods of intimidation were having no effect. It was at this moment that James made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than respond to Lord Pemberton's personal attacks, he turned his attention to Maria Santos. In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he apologized to her on behalf of everyone who had failed to protect her from such treatment. He acknowledged her years of dedicated service and expressed regret that she had been forced to endure such humiliation. The apology had a profound effect on everyone present. Maria's tears, which had been tears of pain and humiliation, transformed into something different. James's words gave her back the dignity that Lord Pemberton had tried to steal. She stood up from the bench, straightened her uniform, and looked Lord Pemberton in the eye for the first time during the entire encounter. What happened next would become the moment that truly set the internet ablaze. Maria Santos, a woman who had spent 15 years being invisible and voiceless in the palace hierarchy, spoke directly to Lord Pemberton in accented but perfect English. She told him that she had served his family at numerous events over the years and had always treated them with respect and professionalism. She explained that she had never done anything to deserve his cruelty and that she was proud of her work and her heritage. Her words carried a quiet power that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. For years, she had accepted her position at the bottom of the palace social structure as simply the way things were. Now, inspired by James's courage, she was finding her own voice and refusing to be silenced by someone who believed that his title gave him the right to treat her as less than human. The young tourist camera captured every second of Maria's transformation from victim to empowered individual. The footage would later show how her posture changed, how her voice grew stronger, and how she reclaimed her dignity in the face of someone who had tried to destroy it. It was a masterclass in quiet courage that would inspire millions of viewers around the world. Lord Pemberton's reaction to Maria's words revealed him to be exactly what James had suspected all along: a small, cruel man who derived pleasure from exercising power over those who couldn't fight back. Faced with a victim who refused to remain victimized and a guard who wouldn't be intimidated, the nobleman's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The confrontation had now attracted the attention of senior palace officials who were hurrying across the courtyard to assess the situation. James could see the approaching figures and knew that his time was running out. Soon, protocols would be restored, reports would be filed, and consequences would be distributed. But for these few minutes, truth and courage had triumphed over privilege and power. As the palace officials drew closer, James retrieved his hat from the ground and placed it back on his head. The symbolic gesture marked his return to official duty, but everyone present understood that something fundamental had changed. The young man who had walked away from his post was not the same person who was now preparing to face whatever consequences awaited him. The morning mist hung low over the palace grounds as James Richardson adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. After 8 years of service as a Queen's Guard, he had perfected the art of standing perfectly still while his mind wandered to places far beyond the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace. The weight of his bearskin hat felt heavier than usual that Tuesday morning, though he couldn't quite explain why. James had always taken pride in his position. Growing up in a small mining town in Yorkshire, he never imagined he would one day stand guard at the most famous residence in Britain. His father had worked the coal mines for 30 years before black lung disease took his breath away piece by piece. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the nearby city, her hands permanently stained by years of scrubbing other people's messes. When James received his appointment to the household division, his parents had tears in their eyes as they watched their son transform into something they had only seen in postcards and television broadcasts. The tourists were already gathering by 9 in the morning, their cameras ready to capture anything remotely interesting. James had learned to ignore their whispered comments about whether the guards were real people or elaborate statues. He had heard every joke, every attempt to make him laugh or move. Children would wave at him with innocent smiles while their parents took photos. Teenagers would dare each other to get closer, to touch his uniform, to see if they could provoke any reaction at all. But today felt different. There was tension in the air that had nothing to do with the changing of the guard's ceremony scheduled for 11 o'clock. James had noticed it during the morning briefing when Sergeant Major Williams spoke in clipped tones about maintaining dignity under all circumstances and remembering that the eyes of the world are always upon us. The other guards had exchanged glances, but no one asked questions. In their line of work, you learned when to speak and when to simply listen. The first sign of trouble came at 10:30 when a black sedan with diplomatic plates pulled through the main entrance. James watched from his peripheral vision as 3 men in expensive suits emerged from the vehicle. He recognized the middle one immediately. It was Lord Pemberton, a man whose name appeared regularly in the society pages and whose influence extended far beyond the marble hallways of Parliament. Lord Pemberton was known for his sharp tongue and his belief that certain people were born to rule while others existed solely to serve. He had inherited his title, his estate, and his sense of superiority from a long line of ancestors who had never questioned their place at the top of Britain's social hierarchy. At 62 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted, and never been forced to consider that his actions might have consequences. James had encountered Lord Pemberton twice before during his years of service. Both times had left him with a bitter taste in his mouth and a growing understanding of why his grandfather used to spit whenever he mentioned the aristocracy. The first incident had occurred 3 years earlier when Lord Pemberton had insisted that a guard should move aside so he could take a photo in front of the palace doors. When the guard politely explained that he couldn't abandon his post, Lord Pemberton had complained to his superiors about insubordinate staff who didn't understand their place. The second incident had been worse. Last spring, during a garden party, Lord Pemberton had made several inappropriate comments to one of the female staff members. When she reported his behavior, the complaint had mysteriously disappeared, and she had been quietly transferred to a different department. The message was clear. Some people were above accountability, and others were expected to accept whatever treatment they received. Now, as James watched Lord Pemberton stride across the courtyard with the swagger of a man who owned everything he surveyed, he felt his jaw clench involuntarily. Behind Lord Pemberton walked his personal assistant, a nervous young man who carried a briefcase and checked his watch every few seconds. The third man was unfamiliar, but his expensive clothing and confident demeanor suggested he moved in the same circles as his companions. They were heading toward the staff entrance, where several palace employees were gathered for what appeared to be their morning break. James could see Maria Santos among them, a woman who had worked in the palace kitchens for 15 years. Maria was one of the hardest working people James had ever met. She arrived before dawn every day to prepare meals for the royal family and their guests. Her English was heavily accented, but her dedication was absolute. She sent most of her wages back to her family in Portugal, where her elderly parents depended on her support. James had gotten to know Maria over the years through brief conversations during shift changes. She always asked about his family and remembered details about his life that impressed him. When his father had passed away 2 years earlier, Maria had approached him after the funeral with a small box of homemade pastries and a gentle hug that said more than words ever could. She was the kind of person who made the palace feel less like a monument and more like a place where real people worked and cared about each other. As Lord Pemberton approached the group of staff members, James noticed the change in their body language. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People found sudden interest in their shoes or the sky above. The relaxed atmosphere of their break time evaporated like morning mist under the harsh glare of the sun. Lord Pemberton stopped directly in front of Maria, who was sitting on a small bench eating a simple sandwich. James couldn't hear the initial words exchanged, but he could see the confusion on Maria's face transform into something that looked like fear. The other staff members began to drift away, unwilling to get involved in whatever was unfolding. James felt his heart rate increase. Every instinct told him that something was wrong, but his training demanded that he remain at his post. He had sworn an oath to serve with dignity and discipline. He had been taught that personal feelings had no place in his duties. The Queen's Guard were meant to be symbols of stability and tradition, not individuals who acted on their own impulses. But as he watched Lord Pemberton's animated gestures and Maria's increasingly distressed expression, James found himself questioning everything he had been taught about duty and obedience. There were rules about when a guard could abandon his post, and none of them covered situations like this. Yet there were also deeper rules about human decency that seemed to matter more with each passing second. The incident escalated when Lord Pemberton raised his voice loud enough for James to catch fragments of his words. The phrases that reached James across the courtyard made his blood run cold. Lord Pemberton was berating Maria for something, using language that no human being should have to endure, especially not while simply trying to eat lunch after hours of hard work. James could see tears forming in Maria's eyes. Her sandwich lay forgotten on the bench beside her as she tried to respond to Lord Pemberton's tirade. The few remaining staff members looked anywhere except at the scene unfolding before them. No one was coming to Maria's defense. No one was willing to risk their own position to protect a colleague who was being publicly humiliated. The assistant with the briefcase stood slightly behind Lord Pemberton, his face a mask of professional indifference. He had clearly witnessed scenes like this before. The third man actually seemed to be enjoying the display, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched a powerful man exercise his authority over someone with no power to fight back. James felt something break inside him. It wasn't a dramatic moment of revelation or a sudden burst of anger. It was more like the quiet snap of a rope that had been stretched too thin for too long. He thought about his father, who had treated every person he met with respect regardless of their station in life. He thought about his mother, who had endured condescending remarks from her employers but had never lost her dignity. He thought about Maria's kindness after his father's funeral and the way she always smiled when she saw him, even during her busiest days. The formal training that had been drilled into him for 8 years began to war with something deeper and more fundamental. James understood that his next decision would define not just this moment, but who he was as a person. He could continue to stand at attention, following protocols that protected his career and maintained the status quo. Or he could choose to be the person his parents had raised him to be, regardless of the consequences. Lord Pemberton's voice grew louder, and James could now hear every cruel word being directed at Maria. The accusations were baseless and vicious, designed purely to inflict emotional pain. Maria was being accused of being lazy, incompetent, and unworthy of her position. Lord Pemberton seemed to be building towards some kind of climax, his face red with artificial rage as he towered over the seated woman. James made his choice. He took his first step away from his post in 8 years of service. Then he took another. By the third step, he was walking with purpose across the courtyard toward a confrontation that would change everything. He didn't think about his career, his pension, or the disciplinary action he would surely face. He thought only about Maria, sitting alone on that bench, enduring treatment that no human being should have to accept in silence. The few tourists who noticed a Queen's Guard moving unexpectedly began to point and raise their cameras. None of them understood what they were about to witness, but something in James's determined stride suggested that history was about to be made. The morning mist had completely lifted now, and the autumn sun cast sharp shadows across the palace courtyard as James Richardson prepared to throw away everything he had worked for in defense of everything he believed in. His red tunic seemed brighter than usual as he crossed the space between his post and his destiny. The gold buttons caught the sunlight, and his black boots made firm contact with the ancient stones beneath his feet. With each step, he moved further away from the safety of anonymity and closer to a moment that would soon be seen by millions of people around the world. James Richardson was no longer just a Queen's Guard. He was about to become a symbol of something that transcended uniforms and protocols. He was about to remind the world that sometimes the most important duty of all is simply being human. In the heart of London, where centuries of tradition stand as solid as the ancient stone walls themselves, a single moment of human defiance would shatter the silence that had protected royal dignity for generations. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace would end with millions of people around the world questioning everything they thought they knew about respect, authority, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. The viral video lasted only 47 seconds. But those 47 seconds would expose a truth so shocking that it would force one of the world's oldest monarchies to confront a reality they had spent decades trying to hide. The man at the center of it all wasn't a politician, activist, or celebrity. He was simply a guard who decided that some lines should never be crossed, no matter who's watching. This is the story of how one person's refusal to stay silent changed everything.